Okay, so my talk has a very long title, and the first part of the title, how the myth of the unavoidable bycatch prevents us from getting the incentives right. That's only the first part of the title. It was the title of a talk I gave almost a year ago at the European Commission, and I liked the title, but in the meanwhile the talk got a bit expanded, so that's the second part of the title and other tales. Now, as Emer already said, I work here at UCC, but I'm never here because I'm based at the Marine Institute. So this is the first time that I'm actually telling people here about my work. And some people from the Marine Institute contributed to the work in this talk, and a person from Deirdre from Queen's University of Belfast, and Mike from NUIG, and Jörn Schmidt from Germany contributed to this talk. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fisheries management and the problems we are facing in fisheries management. And the biggest problem, of course, of fisheries management is that globally there is the threat or the reality of resources being overfished. So that's the main problem. There's too much fishing activity going on for the size of the resource. And that's what fisheries management is all about. It's trying to manage and restrict fishing such that the whole system is in a sustainable equilibrium. Now, one of the problems that fisheries managers have is that they want to know the state of the resource, and therefore they need fisheries scientists who estimate and assess the state of the resource. So you need to know the processes that are going on and the historical state of the resource in order to predict what happens under certain catch restrictions or other management measures. And this picture here is very vague, and that's on purpose because there's a lot of uncertainty in the assessment and the estimates of the state of the resource. And that's one of the problems in fisheries management, that fisheries scientists can only estimate the state of the resource, the fish, with a lot of uncertainty. But that's one of the problems I'm not going to talk about today. But another problem in fisheries management is that the behavior of the fishers is often not taken into consideration. And this is very strange, of course, because fisheries management is supposed to set rules for how the fishermen should behave or how their behavior should be modified in order to fish sustainably. So it's very strange that fisheries managers and also fisheries management scientists have overlooked the behavior of the fishermen and the responses of the fishermen to the regulations very much. It's starting to get better in the last couple of years. People start to understand that we have to look at the behavior of the fishermen. So in the rest of my talk, I will focus very much on the behavior of the fishermen. Now, the first thing that is a problem is that fishermen tend to see the regulations as something that is opposing their interest. And of course that is not specific to fishermen. It's the same for all of us. We tend to think that the state and its rules and laws are somehow curtailing us in the things that we want to do. It's our enemy. They tell us what we should not do. And so that's not specific to fishermen. But the problem is, if the fishermen feel that these regulations are opposing their interests, they will be less inclined to comply with the regulations, to the letter as well as to the spirit. And to the letter, I mean, of course, that they could feel the temptation to do illegal activities, but with non-compliance to the spirit, I mean that they will try to find loopholes in the law so that they can still act within the letter of the law, but do things that are actually not corresponding to the aims of the law. So they will actually undermine the objectives of the law. And again, this is of course very familiar to us. Let's say nobody likes to pay taxes, and we all try to find ways of paying as little taxes as possible within the law. But of course thereby we undermine the whole purpose of that. So this is nothing special about fishers, but it is something we have to take into account. And it is very sad that fishers feel that way, because I wrote this word sustainability here. That's because it's in the interest of all of us, and especially in the interest of the fishers themselves, to fish sustainably, to have the resource go on forever and not deplete it. Now, I have this picture of the carrot here, because for me the carrot is the symbol of the concept of incentives. And an incentive is something that drives people to do a certain thing. It's actually, it's the opposite of a sanction. So a sanction tries to discourage people to do a certain thing because there's the threat of a penalty. But an incentive tries to encourage people to behave in a certain way. And I think we should look more at incentives when we think of trying to modify fishers' behavior to fish according to reaching sustainability. How do we get fishermen to want to behave in that particular way? Now, this is, of course, I'm not the first person on earth who looks at it that way, because already 2.5 millennia ago, Solon, one of the good old Greeks in Athens, already thought about this problem. So he was a law person, a man who had to make the laws in Athens, and he had this problem. He felt it is a challenge to keep the greed of the people within bounds by laws. And with greed, I don't necessarily mean some sort of nasty trait. I just mean this trait that we all try to promote our own interests in our behavior. And how do we to keep that within the bounds by laws? And Solon thought you have to do that by phrasing laws in such a way that it is very clear to the people who have to behave according to the law that this law is to their advantage. So the people should feel a benefit of behaving according to the law or the regulation. So that's very important, I think, that Solon invented this way of looking at it 2,500 years ago, so we should still listen to him. Now, the concept of perverse incentives, this is a concept that we read about a lot in fisheries management literature. It means that there is an incentive, so an encouragement to do a certain thing, but it is actually opposing the original aim of the regulation. So it encourages the people to do exactly the wrong thing. And I'll give you a few examples to this. For example, in fisheries management, there are lots of bycatch regulations, which say, for example, in this area you're allowed to fish and target some species only if you make sure that you catch less than 5% cod. And this measure is done, of course, to protect cod, to try to keep the fishing mortality on cod low. But fishers can achieve that low percentage by catching a lot of other things. So the rule doesn't make sense. They still would catch as much cod, but they just catch a lot of extra even. And they do that by taking smaller mesh sizes and catching a lot of rubbish so that their percentage of cod is low. And all this stuff that they then catch, like starfish and so, will also be dead. So the whole regulation works actually counter the idea of sustainable fishing. The cod mortality doesn't get down, and the mortality of everything else gets up, and the fishers just behave according to the rule. They just said, well, I did nothing wrong. I've changed my fishing behavior to have my cod catches below 5%. So that's a perverse incentive. Now, another one is that in Europe we currently limit the fishing activities mainly by landings constraints. So all the fish quota constrain the amount of landings that the fisherman is allowed to bring to land. And it is it does not restrict the actual catches. Now, this is soon going to change in Europe, hopefully, but until now this is still the case. So the idea is a fisherman is legally allowed to catch 100 million tons of everything without violating the law, as long as he doesn't land it. So there will be a lot of over quota catches of fish that are then dead, so it doesn't help with sustainable fishing. And he's legally allowed to do that, and it is not restricted by the current legalization. Now, I will try to explain why this happens especially in the mixed demersal fisheries. There's a lot of this over quota discarding going on. Now, if you imagine a trawler who goes over the bottom of the Celtic Sea, then this is what happens. So if you haven't seen exactly what's going on there, let's say this trawler targets the nephrops, the red things there. And in the same area on the bottom are also whiting, cod and haddock. And the fisherman targets nephrops, that's what he wants. But in some sort of unavoidable way, while he's going with his trawl over the bottom, he will catch all the other things in his net as well. So the situation then could be, sort of an abstract illustration of it, the situation could then be that there are two species, A and B, each with their quota, their total allowable catch, which is total allowable landings, and each with a certain amount of fishing effort that is needed to get that catch. Now, the fisherman will then fish, and you could say, what will he do? Will he stop fishing when he has caught up his quota for species A? No, he will not, because then he would forego the catches of species B. And he has a legal right to catch species B, so he will go on fishing until he has caught species B. Then he will unavoidably catch those fish of species A as well, which he is not allowed to land. They will be discarded. So they will be dead, they will be overfished because they are caught. He doesn't even sell them on the market because he has to discard them. So this is a very perverse regulation, of course, because it doesn't help anything. Now, the first time that I heard about this, this problem of mixed demersal fisheries and bycatch and overquota and all that was when I still worked and lived in the Netherlands. And this is a Dutch beam trawler. The Dutch fishery, the beam trawl fishery, mainly fishes on flatfish, plaice and sole in the North Sea with the beam trawl. And this particular beam trawler, the UK 243, is owned by a man, a Dutch fisher called Jan van den Berg. And the word UK does not stand for United Kingdom, but the main fishing port in the Netherlands is called Urk, and all the boats that have this as a home port have UK as a name. So the fisher of this particular ship, who fishes for plaice and sole in the North Sea, I had a conversation with him in 2004, and I had just freshly started in fishery science, and I had learned from my colleagues that we have this problem of the unavoidable bycatch. So I said to him, well, I've heard that sole and plaice are unavoidably caught together. And he started to laugh and he said, no, 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 of course not. We can target one without the other and the other without the one. It's not at all unavoidable. So I was really puzzled and I thought, well, if you can do that, why don't you? And then he said, well, why should I? I need to fish where I fish because I want to make my trip profitable, and it's not only sole and plaice, but there are lots of other fish which are not even quota species, so those are not restricted by quota, which he needs to catch to make his trip profitable. So I was really intrigued, and I said to this man, can we have some more correspondence about this in the future, because I really have to think about this, what's going on here. So we decided that he would email me, and he emailed me actually from his ship when he was on a trip. And this is what he emailed me. I know that most of you cannot read Dutch, but I kept the text in Dutch just to show that this is really the original text of his email. Just copied and pasted it on this slide. And what he's saying here, he tells me the location where he is, which is the yellow star there. And he's telling me what he's catching right now, the quantities of species of fish that he's catching. And I have them here in this diagram, and it's not so important to read the species names. You just have to see he gets 5 species in certain proportions. Now, he wrote to me, if I would go 20 miles to the east, which is there, I would arrive at a different fishing ground, and I would then catch those species in different quantities. The same species, but in different proportions. And he told me, if I would go, for example, 50 miles to the north, which is there, I would again catch completely different proportions of those species. So he told me he can actually change the catch composition, the composition of the various species within the catch, by just going a bit to the north or the south or the east or the west. By just finding a different location, he can adjust his catches. And he said to me, you know, underwater it's just like a supermarket. You just have to know where everything lies, and then you can just take it and choose what you want. So I found that really puzzling, because I thought, well, if that is the case, we would actually have this situation, that he could exactly fish the 2 quota or the 5 quota or the 10 quota exactly. It would not be necessary to do this over quota discarding. So what's going on here? Now, I think what is going on here is that something is wrong with the incentives, because this man doesn't feel an incentive not to discard sole or place, one or the other. It's legal, he does nothing wrong, so he wants to get these catch compositions that he gets because there are other species in it that he wants to make his trip profitable, and he can just catch these over quota fish and throw them back and not land them, and there's nothing wrong with that. So he doesn't feel any drive to do it in this other way, in this way. So, and in my opinion, that is what we should do, and I'll talk about that later a bit more. We should internalize the cost of exceeding the quota, because as the situation is now, the cost of exceeding quota are external to the individual fishing business. And with external, I mean that the cost of overfishing, we all have to bear those costs. So our fish stocks are being overexploited and depleted and all that, and all the fishers and all the future fishers. So the costs are shared by everyone, and it would help if the costs of overfishing would be felt by the person who fishes, so that he has to adjust his behavior not to feel those costs. Now, this is an abstract of a study that has been done in Canada, and I only want to show you that indeed, again, I'm not the only one thinking in this direction. These people in Canada, what they said, optimizing the yield of a multi-species fishery would be possible when fishers have a high degree of control over the species mixture. And according to the Dutch fisherman Jan van den Berg, he thinks he has a high control over his species mixture. But these Canadians also, or they're not Canadians, but they also say the incentives are usually not in place. And that was my idea as well. They say there's one exception. There is this fishery in British Columbia where there are 22 different species, and they have there a management system which is characterized by, first of all, 100% observer coverage. That means that each fishing trip has an observer of the government who is on board and who checks what is being caught. So everything that is being caught, not just what is being landed, but also what is being discarded, is counted, and it is all accounted or deducted from the quota. So the quota does not only restrict the landings, but it restricts the total catch. Discards are deducted from the quota as well. And they found that in that case, fishers are able, as Jan van den Berg also thought, they are able to adjust their catches so that they fish exactly the TACs. So this is what they do in British Columbia. And this is what Jan van den Berg thinks he can do, but of course we are not sure, because this is only the anecdote of one man, and it was not even based on data, because he only said, I think I would go, if I would go north or south or whatever, I would get those catch compositions. So we are not sure, perhaps it's just his fantasy. So let's look a bit at some data. And this picture is based on Irish data. I think it's data from 2006 to 2010 or 2011 or something like that. And what it is, it's all the landings data from all the whole region. Oh, now I did it wrong. Yeah, sorry. Around Ireland. And each little square here you see a magnified version of that square. And in each square you see several colors. which represent these fish species. So red for cod, green for haddock, purple for nephrops, and light blue for monkfish, and all the other species which are, oh, now I do it again, which are listed here. And the size of the area there is the proportion in the landings of that species. And already if you see all these squares seem to have very different colors. And I have some close-ups of 3 regions. So if you look at the close-up here in the Celtic Sea, now what you see here is that at a scale of nautical miles, so at a very small spatial scale, the proportion of fish in the landings varies enormously. So a fisherman whose quota for this purple thing is almost full, but he still wants something orange. If he goes here, there's a lot of orange, but no purple. So at very small scales, and these data and the analysis that my colleague at the Marine Institute did shows that this is kind of persistent. It's not varying over time, but the fishes know that this is the case. So fishes could go a few miles to the east or the west or south or the north to get a different catch composition. The same to the west of Ireland and to the north. At very small spatial scales, the catch compositions vary. Now you could still think, okay, so it is possible to adjust catch compositions in our waters, but would fishes actually want to do that? For example, there is this concept of métier. A fishing métier means that a fisher has a certain way of doing his business. For example, he always goes in a certain season to a certain fishing ground with a certain gear and certain target species or assemblage of target species. That's what he does, and he doesn't want to suddenly change and do something else. Now, this picture, I find it a very beautiful picture, but it's very difficult to understand. It's by my colleague Sarah Davian. I always put it in because it looks like the star constellations in the night sky, but that's of course not what it is. What it is each of these red points, red numbers, indicates a specific fishing métier, so a way of fishing, as I just said, with a specific gear, a specific fishing ground, etc. And all these white loops mean that the probability is very high that if a fisher did this métier in a certain week, he will do the same métier in the next week. But all these blue lines mean that there's also a probability that a fisherman who does a certain métier in 1 week does a different métier next week. So for example here, métier number 10, there's a high probability that next week he does again métier number 10. But there's also a probability, now I don't even know where it's going to, but you can follow all these blue lines, and from light blue to dark blue the probability is from high to low. So fishers do change a lot from week to week. They actually do change from one métier to the other. So fishers are actually very flexible. So again, I think it should be possible for the fishers here in Europe to behave according to this picture. So then again, why don't they? And again, there's perhaps something there about the internalizing of the costs. So how could that be done? How could you internalize the cost of fishing? Now, one way is what the Canadian study showed, that is to set catch quota, where the amount of catch, which is landings plus discards, is the thing that they're not allowed to exceed. And of course, if you do that, they have to stop fishing, otherwise they get a fine or so. They have to stop fishing when the quota of each of the species is exceeded, so they will have to adjust their catches, as the Canadian study shows. And it will help if these catches, if the fishers have individual shares of catches, so share of the total allowable catch is for each particular fisherman. Now, another way I think we could internalize those costs is by a system I call RTI, and that is an approach to fisheries management that I invented with a couple of colleagues. Emer was also one of them, and Dave Reed. We have invented a fisheries management approach that is not yet practiced anywhere, but we have presented it to the European Commission and to the stakeholders in the RACs and to other scientists. Since about 1.5 years we are presenting these ideas everywhere, and we are exploring how it could work. And the idea that we came up with, we call it RTI, which stands for real-time incentives. And it works like this. In this system, each vessel gets an annual quota of RTIs, for example, 150 per year. And an RTI is, let's say, something like a fishing impact equivalent, so a fishing impact credit. So it's something like credit, and they start every year with, let's say, 150 or 200. That has to be fixed in some way. And then they have these RTIs. I just call them RTIs, but they're, as I said, the fishing impact equivalents. And if they have them, the fishermen can fish wherever they want, when and where they want, but they have to pay according to the tariffs in a so-called tariff map. And it works like this. If a fisherman fishes in the red areas, he will have to pay 5 RTIs per day. So he is allowed to fish there, but because he has only 150 per year, for example, and here he pays 5 per day, he will not fish there very often. But if he goes, let's say, to white or yellow areas, he pays only 0.1 or 0.5 RTIs per day. So he can stay there much longer. When he's fishing there, there will be no catch or landings quota. So he can catch and land everything he wants. Perhaps there will be some species forbidden and so forth, but just of the commercial target species, he can catch and land everything he wants. Now, the managers would then, of course, set the tariffs according to some objective or target. And in this example, this is data from the cod, the Irish data of the cod fishery. And LPUE means landings per unit of effort, is a measure for, let's say, the spatial distribution of the abundance. And it's no coincidence, because I did that on purpose, that these two pictures look exactly the same. So what the managers did in this hypothetical example is they say, okay, in the red areas, abundance is relatively high. Well, there are even black areas where abundance is higher, and they will be closed. Abundance of cod is so high. So imagine that the managers want to restrict fishing mortality on cod. So they say, okay, we allow them to go to the areas where there's high abundance of cod. They can catch it, they can take it, but not too often. So they discourage that by making the tariff very high. But then managers have said, okay, in all these regions where cod abundance is much lower, fishers can go and target other species instead of cod, keeping the fishing mortality on cod low, and there they can go and pay only very few RTIs. So there they can go as often as they want. So the managers will set the tariffs according to an objective. And the idea is, we think, that in these RTI tariffs you can incorporate objectives not only for one target species, as you see here, cod, but you can incorporate tariffs for all target species, or a whole bunch of them, in one currency, the RTI currency. And moreover, you can even put all kinds of other ecosystem considerations, so not the commercial target species, but other things also in the tariff system. So for example, if managers want to avoid that fishes go to a vulnerable habitat or something where there are cold water corals, or places where there are perhaps lots of dolphins, if the managers want to prevent that fishes go there, they just make high tariffs in those localities. And I have an example here of vulnerable elasmobranchs, sharks and rays and skates. And in this picture you see, again, based on data, where the discard rates of these species, which are forbidden to land because they have to be protected, but the discard rates are very high in these locations there. So you could imagine that you just superimpose the red and black on the map we had originally. So you make high tariffs there, not because of cod, but because of elasmobranchs. So fishes can go there, but they will have to pay 5 RTIs per day, and in the black ones they don't go at all. So We think that this is a nice system, the RTI system, because it does not prescribe and forbid, and it actually gives the fishermen all freedom to fish whenever, wherever and whenever they want. So that should make the fishermen happy, we think. But it also helps that the costs to the ecosystem are internalized to his business. These costs of overfishing, the cod stock for example, but also the costs of catching these elasmobranchs, he will have to take them into account, and he will have to pay those costs, not so much in terms of money, he won't get a fine, but he pays those costs in terms of the rate at which he depletes his RTI account. Very simple, you can go there, but you will very quickly get through your 150 RTIs. That's how he pays for the costs. So the fisherman feels it then very much as his own trade-off. He has the 150 RTIs, and if he spends them, he will automatically protect cod and other things as the managers have decided that they should. So what about real-time? Why do I call them real-time incentives? Now, it is our idea is that these tariff maps can be updated every week. So information from the fishery that will be monitored through e-log books and VMS, that's the vessel monitoring system which sends a signal to a satellite. So it will be monitored every week where the fishes catch high amounts of this or that. And so based on real-time information of the previous week, the colors of the cells can be updated because the place where the fish are has changed. So that's the real-time aspect of it. So again, in summary, we think this is a good idea because the cost of overfishing and other costs to the ecosystem are internalized. Fishers have to take them into account in their business decisions. And apart from that, they're flexible and they can do what they want. And as far as we can think of, there are no perverse incentives and no opposing requirements for the fishermen. Another interesting thing here is that we have all these modern technologies now with e-log books and VMS data that are sent to satellites. So we think a lot of the compliance and accounting of their RTI quota can be done automatically. Just like when you drive, let's say, on the motorway to Dublin and you have your account and your number plate is photographed and then you automatically pay the toll. In such a way, we think it could be implemented that the fishers automatically get the RTIs deducted from their account. And then lastly, the maps can be dynamically updated, as I just showed you with the cod information, but actually with any kind of information, dolphins, cold water corals, elasmobranchs. And this information, of course, has to be weighted according to a decision made by the managers based on what society wants. So in the example I just gave, I had that the elasmobranchs overruled everything else. So every cell that was red or black for the elasmobranchs became red or black in the tariff map. It doesn't have to be like this. It could also be an average between the color for cod and the color for elasmobranchs if that's what society wants. It is a decision that has to be made by stakeholders. But so they can be weighted according to the objectives. Now, since we have proposed this system and presented it to the world at various occasions, conferences and all that, we got a lot of feedback from people. And people were always saying, yeah, that sounds all very nice, but what if fishers do this and what if fishers do that? For example, what if fishers would all go in the first week to the red areas? Does the system then collapse? Or, and not only in the first week, but all the time to the red areas. Or what would happen if the efficiency, their catch efficiency, suddenly increases a lot, which is very likely to happen because as soon as they're not restricted anymore by a catch or a landings quota, but they're allowed to catch everything. Now normally in the current situation, fishermen are always sort of inhibiting a bit their catch rates because they have to fulfill these catch quotas. But if they don't anymore, they could become very much more efficient and get much higher catch rates. So higher catch rates than the managers have anticipated when they set the tariffs and allocate the RTIs. Will the system collapse then or not? So these kind of questions I got, and these are good questions. So we wanted to explore how robust this system is under a range of behavior profit maximizing fisher strategies. So I made a very small simulation model, very simple one, with a 10 by 10 area with grid cells with different colors, where fish, hypothetical fish, are in different abundances and their tariffs, and they change from week to week. And I sort of simulated that fishers do things and what happens when they do this or that. Now, these are very preliminary outcomes of some of the simulations that I just ran this week and last week, and the picture, the graphics, I still have to deal with the formatting. It's not very clear, but I will explain to you what you should look at. Basically, you should look at this black line, which is the fishing mortality rate in the system. And here's the stippled line, which is the target. And there are two lines above and below it, which are plus or minus 10% of the target. And what I did in my simulations is that initially they get 200 RTIs, and every year the managers check whether the fishing mortality rate was outside of these plus or minus limits, and if so, they got a reduced or increased number of RTIs in the next year. And what you see here is that if they fish with an increased efficiency, then indeed initially the fishing mortality rate is much too high. But just by this simple rule, they start with 200. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's 20 here, but it is really 200. They start with 200, and every year they get a reduction until the fishing mortality rate dropped within those bounds. And here it even became a bit too low, and that's why they got a bit more again, and here again. So now they fish more efficiently, but instead of 200, they get about 120 RTIs per day. So no problem here for the system. The system can manage, is robust when fishers are more efficient, and can adjust the number of RTIs. So that's fine. And here the same. If all fishers go to the cells with high abundance, also in the beginning it's too high, here it undershoots it, and then it remains quite stable with a much lower number of RTIs, so that's fine. Now, the situation I originally had in mind when I came up with the system was that some fishers would target the cells with the high abundance for this hypothetical fish, and other fishers would target other things. Let's say if it's caught, these other fishers would target hake or nephrops or haddock, and go for the cells with low caught abundances so that they can fish much longer and are always in these white and yellow cells with low tariffs. So if you do that, a certain proportion of fishes go to the high abundance cells and the others go to the low abundance cells, then you're already quite right from the start, and you can actually go on with the 200 RTIs, and it just fluctuates a bit around the target. So there you can see that the system really works. And now the interesting thing is I also got a lot of feedback from people who said, yeah, but fishers will of course also cheat. They will misreport. And if they're clever, they will even misreport strategically. What they will do is, if they are in a cell with high abundance and they want to fish there next week, they want to artificially lower the tariff for that cell for next week. So they will underreport the catches, so that the real-time updating of the cells will get that they get a low tariff in that cell where they can catch a lot of fish next week. So that's what they will do, perhaps. So of course I tried to simulate that. And again, the same proportion of fishers, and again the system does not crash. Indeed, of course, in the first instance the fishing mortality is much too high, and you will have to adjust downward the number of RTIs available to the fishery. And after that, things are fine. Of course, here you will get very interesting dynamics between the fishers, because the ones who do not cheat will not like it that they get fewer RTIs, because here in this simulation everybody gets fewer RTIs, also the ones that didn't cheat, and it's the fault of the cheaters. So there are lots of interesting things that you can investigate, but in principle the system holds. So, so far I have explored whether adaptive management can cope with things like increased efficiency and strategic misreporting. It works quite fine. But I actually want to know whether the system can cope with all kinds of strategic behavior that anybody in the world can come up with, because I cannot come up with all strategies. I don't know what fishers all think, and even more, fishers probably don't even know it themselves. They will go out and do their thing, and they don't know exactly, like all of us, probably all of us have a lot of strategic behavior in our daily life, but you don't actually know the algorithm you use when you try to find the shortest queue in the supermarket or whatever. You don't really know what you're doing, but you're doing it, but you couldn't even explain it to someone. So I thought, how would I program all these algorithms of clever fishermen if we don't even know what they are? So I thought, you know what? We have to make an interactive game, so the same simulation as we had before, but interactive, so you will be asked to play it as a player against, let's say, 99 programmed fishers, and you are one who has to try to get maximal catches or maximal profits. And we will then try to find out how we can make the system robust to that. Now, I did actually program such a game, but I'm not a very good programmer, and to make a game attractive, I thought that's a bit above my league. So that's why we collaborate with a group of Germans who have developed a fishing game on a tabletop thing. So this is already there. It has been played in various situations. 4 players can play at this table, and they have to click on cells, and then they catch fish, and they can try to maximize their profits and all that. So we want to collaborate with these people to try to get this RTI system implemented on their table, and then get fishers to play it, and even ask the fishers to do as nasty or so, which is of course just normal natural human behavior, but to do as nasty as they can, so that they actually help us to make the system robust to all kinds of behavior that they can come up with. So now this is almost one of the last things that I'm going to talk about. One more thing, important thing here is that until now I did all my simulations and illustrations with only one species, and sometimes I just put those elasmobranchs in. But how are we going to set up the tariffs if we want to deal with multiple targets for 4 or 5 species and 3 or 4 or 5 ecosystem considerations? How does that work? For example, here you have 4 pictures of the most important commercial species, the cod, nephrops, haddock and whiting, and here you have the elasmobranchs again in the Celtic Sea, and they of course all have different distributions. So I could imagine if you would set up a tariff map that just takes the average of the 4 commercial species with let's say all equal weight in that average, you would get a certain tariff map. But perhaps managers say, well, we don't want them equally weighted. Perhaps nephrops and cod should get a double weight because they are more important or something. And then the map would look different, because this is the other one and that is this one. So the map would look different. And again, you can say perhaps they just want to give triple weight to cod. So whatever the decision is by the managers, which will have to be informed by what people want, the tariff map will look different. And then again, if you have the elasmobranchs in it, in this case with something that completely overrules them, so all cells where you have elasmobranch catches will be black here, and cod has triple weight, then again the map looks very different. And of course you can also say we don't make them black, but we make an average between black and yellow. So what I want to do is to do lots of simulations with actual data from the Celtic Sea, so not these small simple simulations with the 10 by 10 grid, but real simulations about the Celtic Sea and the fish stocks there, and just follow how each of these scenarios would work out, and some more scenarios. So scenarios of different weightings, how would that work out for the chances that these species stocks don't collapse and that the elasmobranchs survive and all that. So that's what I still have to plan in the future. Now, the last thing is that, as I said before, these decisions about these weights will have to be made by society. So what you then usually do is you have the stakeholders, these are the people who want to have to say something about it. So there is the representatives of the fishing industry, there are environmental NGOs and others. These are the people who want to have a say. And we want to design a way how they can, in a participatory decision-making process, decide what the weights should be. And this is again only something that is planned and that we haven't done yet. But I thought it would be nice to bring those people together, these stakeholders, 20 people or so, in a room, and then let them play the game. For two reasons. I thought playing a game is fun, so people will be in a good mood. But also you bring them in the mood of fishing. What is it about? There are things at stake there. And then we would do choice experiments and a Q survey with them. And the Q survey is going to be done by a PhD student in Belfast, Deirdre. And a choice experiment is a way, and a Q survey also, they're both ways of trying to quantify preferences and opinions of a group of people in a systematic way. And we would like to use the outcomes of that to set a scenario for these weightings to get at the tariffs. And then perhaps again let them give feedback on whether they think they like that scenario. But first, with the choice experiments and the Q survey, you don't ask them explicitly about the tariffs. You ask them lots of questions, and based on their answers you get a quantitative picture of the opinions of the group. And an example of a choice experiment, but as I said we haven't done it, it's just an illustration. In a choice experiment what you would do is you would list a couple of attributes, which in this case are the fishing opportunity for cod, fishing opportunity for nephrops, and the state of the prohibited elasmobranchs, and personal annual income. And each of them has several levels, namely stay the same, or it increases or decreases a bit. And in choice experiments, I've been told you always have to put the personal income in it, because you're actually asking people how willing are they to sacrifice a little bit of their own personal income to, for example, increase the protection of an elasmobranch. So with these attributes you would then make something they call choice cards, and this is a choice card, and each participant would have to fill in 5 or 10 of these cards. And on each card there will be 3 options. They have to tick only one box, and one of the options will be no change, and then there will be 2 other options where something changes to the negative and something to the positive. And they get 5 or 10 of these cards, and they quickly have to fill in each time which option they prefer. And of course you want to know whether the person is a representative of the fishing industry or of an environmental NGO or of something else. And then somehow, I don't know yet how, you can get a quantitative picture of their opinion. And the other one is the Q survey, which is something that Deirdre has already prepared. What you give them is 47 statements on cards. And these statements are things like, I find elasmobranchs important, or I want to make a lot of profit fishing. But these are a bit simplistic. Deirdre has made very sophisticated statements on cards. And the thing is that the people, the participants, have to place them on this grid, where the ones that you disagree with most you put here, and the ones that you agree with most you put here. And let's say disagree a bit is here and agree a bit is there. And by this shape here, you force the people to make a trade-off themselves, because they cannot have everything with most agree and most disagree. They have to say to themselves, well, I do disagree actually with 3 things, but I can put only 2 of them in the most disagree, so I have to choose which one do I most disagree with, and on the other side, of course, most agree with. And apparently, Deirdre has looked this up in the literature, this is a method by which you can quantify the preferences of a group of people, and we will then use whatever comes out of it to try to set those weights for the tariffs. And if the system ever gets implemented in the real world, I think even you can use this every year or every 2 years or every 3 years to update, because preferences in society might change, or a new group can suddenly come along in the stakeholder group who wants to protect a new thing, a worm or something else. So that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
Do I have to switch something off for the recording? Or do we also record the voice, the questions? No. Okay, yeah.
So we have time for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Mark? Obviously with the RTISG, you'll, I guess, decrease the amount of discards of commercial species. Have you been able to estimate what effect this system will have on non-commercial discards, or the sort of the rubbish that can't be landed?
Yeah, good question. No, I mean, we haven't investigated that at all. And I'm happy actually that you say that, because it is something I have to remember. We have to investigate, because indeed if they have no incentive to be careful with all the rest, they might become very uncareful with all the rest. So, yeah. And of course some of the things will be in tariffs, but only if you specify them. If you say we don't want them to fish elasmobranchs, you put a lot of red and black cells there. But there could also be things that nobody has thought of yet and that will suddenly be adversely affected. So I have to think about that. Yeah. Yeah.
When you were assigning different weights to the squares of the grid, you said you could theoretically combine like 4 or 5 species together to assign the weights. Is there a limit to how many species you can combine
Yeah.
for the system to come together?
Yeah, I don't know. That's one of the things I will try to find out in the simulations that I plan for the future, where I first want to try it with 4 species and 1 or 2 or 3 ecosystem considerations. But if it already becomes very difficult there, then you have your answer already. But of course, if that doesn't pose any difficulties, then you have to try it with more and more and more species. I don't know. We have to try it out.
That system should have included other country, other fisher vessels
Yeah.
from other countries.
Yeah.
How you're gonna implement that into the other
Yeah.
countries? Maybe they're more likely to accept that.
Well, probably even the Irish are the most unlikely to accept it.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
they've been accepted by the Irish.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah. Well, I mean, my idea is, of course, we present a plan, or we propose an idea, and of course it's up to the government, either at EU level or at national level to say we like it and we're going to implement it. I can only make clear to them that we think it's a nice idea and publish papers about it. But the thing is, I think it can also work if only part of the fleet uses it. So I could, for example, imagine that all countries fish in the normal way with TACs, and one country, doesn't have to be Ireland, and even if within that country only one particular fleet, and you could even do that as a pilot study that they apply with the European Commission and say, well, could we get an exemption of the normal TACs because we are going to pilot and do this system, and then you just give them RTIs which are equivalent to that part of the fishing mortality that fleet segment would normally have, and then you do the pilot with them. And in principle, I think it can be done if only part of the group uses it and the rest have their normal quota.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
You were talking about compliance, like all of the electronic and manual systems
Yeah.
and the e-logbooks, but do you think it would be possible to incorporate an observer program into the tariff, and then perhaps any boats that carry observers got a
Okay. Yeah.
incentive
Yeah.
for doing so?
Yeah. You're right. I think that was also something that Dave was thinking of, that let's say the default tariff is pretty harsh, and everything that the fishers do to be nice, they get a more favorable tariff. So if a fisher says, okay, I will take a observer on board, or I will hang my ship full of cameras, I will do everything you want, then you give them an incentive to give them a better tariff. That's one of the things indeed, yeah. Yeah. And also with selective gear, by the way. So if a fisherman takes a gear which is perhaps difficult to operate, but which makes certain species that they escape much more easily, or undersized fish escape more easily, or this or that, so you tell them, okay, then you get a different tariff map with which they can fish in much more locations for the cheap tariffs. So then you incentivize them to use the selective gear. Yeah.
Have you got initial feedback from fishermen on the RTI?
I think, I mean, initially there was a conference at the Marine Institute where I had a different version of this, a more primitive version of this, and at that conference there were, I think, 3 or 4 fishermen, and one of them was really interested, but later I thought he was actually interested in the aspect of, what was it again? Now, I don't exactly remember, but I think he didn't really understand the consequences yet, and we ourselves did not really understand the consequences yet. So that was one feedback from a fisherman, but I've presented it several times to representatives of the industry, so their POs and their RACs and their groups. And they are usually cautiously interested. They're very much interested, but they are still afraid that there's perhaps something in it that suddenly will not be so nice. And then there's one thing, all fishers have something against effort restrictions, management through effort restrictions. And they think this is effort restrictions. And it is, but actually that aspect of effort restrictions that is nasty for them is not in it. So they should like it, but if they don't really, if they just think, it's effort restriction again, I don't want to hear it. So, and that's the reaction I got also even from the representatives of the industry who were clever enough to understand it fully. But, yeah.
It's just like in terms of, because it's such a dynamic system and it's real time and everything is always changing.
Yeah.
And like say 4 or 5 species, you're gonna, one week it's gonna be black salt here and the next week it's gonna be there.
Mm-hmm.
An average fishing trip is, I don't know, 2-3 weeks. They
Oh,
using
okay.
fuel going to
Yeah.
place to stay in those
Yeah.
different areas, and
Okay.
then those different areas will have different ecosystems, need different nets, so there could be issues that way, that they spending a lot of fuel
Yeah.
fishing here, great fishing, low prices, and then spending 2 or 3 days sailing that direction to get
Yeah.
fuel.
It could be that this is a problem for them, and actually one colleague of mine has also one time said that fishers wouldn't like it if the maps change weekly. He thought monthly would be better, because weekly drives them mad, and monthly would probably be better. So perhaps I should do simulations also to see how robust the system is if you do it monthly. Of course, if you do it monthly, there's more uncertainty, because the variation that happens within that month, you don't capture it. And of course, let's say every day would be even better, but then that's unworkable. So this is indeed a reason why they wouldn't perhaps like it.
So the real-time element is critical, but it's only as good as the data that's being fed into
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And given that your data is going to be purely dictated by where the fishermen are actually fishing, so there's going to be lots of areas where there's no fisherman
Yeah.
collecting data for you.
Yeah.
Doesn't that introduce biases into the data that's being used to set the quotas in the first place? Because you can imagine, you can be sure what the densities are doing where they are sampling the data, but you don't know what's happening in the areas where they're not fishing. So, I mean, part of this is linked to the temporal scale at which these data are likely to be accurate, and the temporal stability in the samples that are taken.
Well, I mean, I think partly the stock assessments would not be any worse than in the usual situation as we do it now, because it's the same data. But for the
spatial scale, though, was there
but the stock assessments will the way how fishery scientists every year try to estimate how big the stock size is this year, and whether the fishing mortality was too high and has to be adjusted, that will still be based on the data as usual, as in the old system, so that is not affected. But here, with the setting of the tariffs, it is. But I'm not worried, because as I'm finding out now in my simulations, is that even if there is misreporting, so where the data are not correct, and if there's adaptive management that checks every year whether the fishing mortality is too high or too low, and you adjust the number of RTIs that they get, the system always came back at the target that I wanted it to have in my simulations. So, of course, it's only simulations, but I'm not too worried that this will go wrong in the real world.
I mean, I suppose part of the issue is to do with the size of your squares.
Yeah.
Have you simulated how variation in those squares might influence the stability of your RTIs, if you like? So, because it would tie in with the question that Ben was talking about. If you make those RTIs too small, then you're making it logistically more difficult for fishermen to comply with the whole process.
Yeah, well, I think indeed one of the things that we want to do in future simulations is that, let's say, in the underlying world that you program in your simulation, you have everything at a much finer detail of spatial and temporal resolution, and then you pretend in your simulation that you don't know that, and that you use a coarser scale, and then you just try to find out how robust the system is if you use it at a coarser scale, knowing that the variation that is under it is not captured. So that you can all try to find out in simulations, and that needs to be done, certainly. And with respect to the places where they don't fish and there's no data coming in, I'm not worried about that, because where they don't fish, they don't catch anything, and as soon as they catch something there, we have data from it.
Well, there could be an economic argument against it, because if no one's sampling from an area for prolonged periods of time because of this data, what you're actually doing is depressing the success of the fisheries, which the fishermen just probably would be very happy with. So do you know what I mean? If you're consistently saying that this is a particularly good area, and as a result no data is being collected from other areas for long periods of time, then you're potentially having a negative impact on the economics of the fisheries.
No, I don't think so, because the fishermen will take care of their own economy. They will try to fish in such a way that they make the best profits, and given the limitations set by sustainability ideas about how much a fishing mortality should be, but they get that fishing mortality that is allowed by biological estimates. But why actually? I mean, there will still be, for the stock assessment, there will be the...
economically unviable in one area,
Yeah.
and you have to start sampling elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Technically, it's got had a low yield in the past,
Yeah.
and they actually potentially develop a better yield.
But everything will be, I think, I'm not sure that I understand you, but I think in the system that will be taken care of automatically. No, but I mean, I think, of course, I've been thinking about the system much longer, but I don't really think that this can be a problem. But I have to tell you, when I did the simulations, I was often surprised about their outcome. So even if you think a long time about the system, until you're actually simulating it, you don't really understand the dynamics. Suddenly you find out, oh, yeah, now that I see it, I can explain it. But before I saw it, I would never have thought that this or that would be an outcome. So you have to do a lot of simulations. But there will, of course, still, like in the usual situation, there will be research vessel surveys, which sample the whole, all the region for stock assessments.
So the policy is actually changing now with respect to bycatches. There's no chance we're going to persuade people to take on the system in the next 2 years.
Well, usually things don't go so fast, but...
I'm just curious as to what is going to happen. Because they are removing the whole bycatch. So this will be a bit of time to...
Well, I mean, even people of the European Commission were interested, because I was actually invited last year to give a talk about this by one of the important persons of the Commission. So, but they are not going to take any fast initiative with this kind of thing until we have done hundreds of more explorations. And it could be because we're also promoting it in the RACs, who are the stakeholders who are trying to make a management plan for the Celtic Sea. And if they would suddenly strongly promote it, then the Commission would sooner go with, but I don't think this will happen in 1 or 2 years. If we are lucky, it will happen in, well, many years. And I could also imagine that this will not really go through as we've proposed it, but that it will inspire people to at least take the spatio-temporal dynamics more into account, because of course in old fisheries management you view the area as one big pond of fish, and the year is the temporal resolution, sort of one by year and by area. And now with all the techniques we have to get the data at a fine resolution, I think managers will go and use those technologies to change fisheries management, and perhaps not exactly as we have proposed it here, but perhaps they will be inspired in using our studies for something new. Yeah. Yeah.
Has your efforts to kind of shift people's perspective on fishing they want to instead of charity, say conferences, change the whole public's perspective into eating fish that's more sustainable? Is there any efforts kind of
I mean, there is of course the Marine Stewardship Council. There are of course initiatives in that, like the Marine Stewardship Council, that give a certificate, a label to fisheries who have complied with certain criteria of fishing sustainably and eco-friendly and all that. So if a fishery can show according to those criteria that they have this, that they are eco-friendly, they get the label. And consumers who like to buy eco-friendly things, they will go to the supermarket and, okay, I buy this one because it has the eco-label.
Is there any kind of efforts to direct consumers fish to change the
I think so, because for example in the Netherlands you have something that is called the Healthy Fish Guide, or the Eco Fish Guide. I don't know exactly how it's called in English, because I of course know the Dutch name. But you have a sort of a table where of all the fish species that you can buy in the supermarket, some are red, you shouldn't buy them, others are yellow, you might, and others are green. And people who like to contribute to a better world buy the green ones, and some other people buy the red ones still. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there was this whole campaign about discards and other species that we could eat last year on TV, about other species. Yeah, yeah. So there is a lot of things being done, I think. Yeah. 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 I mean, people have become more and more aware of that. This is that these things are happening. I mean, 10 years ago when I came in fisheries, I had never heard of the word discards, and I didn't know what it was. And then I found out that the amount of discards are so enormous. I was really shocked. But I think nowadays the people in the street also know it, that this is happening. So. Yeah. Well, that is only in my simplistic simulation target that I set. I mean, this simulation that I do has, of course, no relation with reality. I've just fantasized up a square ocean with hypothetical fish, and I just decided the target has to be at 0.33 for some reason. Well, in the end, it was always the case in my simulation that the average fisherman always got the same amount, but that's actually how I set up the simulation. But the average fisherman got the same amount, and what I still find interesting, I have no idea how difficult this is going to be, But there's going to be interesting dynamics between the fishermen, because some of them will get the better and others will get the worse, especially of course if some cheat and others not, and so forth. So, but on average the fishery was then, in the end, when it was near the target, it was always getting the same catches. So if the catches would have the same price, they would always be as profitable as in the beginning.
Yeah, the lowland fishermen be given the same tariff. They like very small scale
Yeah.
fishermen like in 5 days or so. They like taking in for the standards in the high tariff there. So you can have some extra people trying to get out of it. So
Yeah, we have to think about that. I mean, of course, the tariff maps would depend on what kind of gear they use and what the impact of their gear is. So if they have a eco-friendly gear, they would get lighter tariffs than if they are very destructive. But of course, there will be a problem for some fishers. And if they have destructive gear and there are red tariffs near their home port. But that's what we want the system to say, because we want to discourage them to do those things. So bad luck. If you're doing bad things, you have to stop doing it. Bad luck. So that's what the system is supposed to say. Then this particular fisher who has only red areas around his home port, yeah, well, tough, but he must not spend all his days fishing there.
But what if he doesn't have the finance to get out of that area?
Yeah.
He's got a small vessel, a
Yeah,
vessel.
yeah,
He
yeah.
doesn't have
Yeah.
capabilities
Yeah.
to go beyond that.
Yeah.
So he's limited by his finance rather than what he wants to do.
Yeah. Yeah, well, indeed, these are real problems, but I think in fisheries management, there are also branches of fisheries management who think about that, and for example, whether these people have to be bought out or get subsidies, or whether we want the small-scale fisheries to stay there. Lots of people who have lots of thoughts about that. But of course, with every fisheries management setting, the governments at EU level or at local level have to think about how are we going to deal with the economic consequences. If certain people are going to lose out as a consequence of a new management measure, somebody will have to think about it. How are we going to deal with those people? But that's not specific to this approach. That's with any approach, with all the fisheries management approaches, there will be consequences if you want to limit fishing. I mean, that's the whole thing. The world is fishing too much. So fishing has to be reduced. And when fishing has to be reduced, somebody will have less profits from it.
Then it seems that the big scale fishermen will profit more than the small scale fishermen will profit less.
Yeah. Well, I hope that somebody, not me, will take care of that. But I'm just trying to take care of a little part of the problem and not of everything. But I mean, that's again something that society has to wish also through their voting for a democracy and everything. I mean, they have to wish for it that those people are, let's say, protected by something. But that's not my problem. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sarah, thanks very much for a very interesting. Clearly, it's very interesting to a lot of people here. But we lacked some quantity in terms of the people. We had a mammal talk on Wednesday. Mammals always tend to get big
Okay.
quality in the audience.
Yeah, certainly. I'm also not disappointed about the quantity. There are quite a lot. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see a lot of people.
Thank you. By the way, so we have 4 seminars left this term, and they have changed a little bit from the ones that are advertised on the poster. So ignore the poster for now, and just look at the email I sent around this week. Okay?
Press stop.
Ah.